Good evening and welcome to the first ever virtual ghost story concert at the National Storytelling Festival. My name is Tim Lowry. I am a storyteller from Summerville, South Carolina, and I'm coming to you this evening from the heart of historic Summerville, here in St. Paul's Anglican Churchyard. This church was chartered in the 1840s. We've been burying people in the churchyard ever since. The earliest grave is marked 1847. Just over my shoulder, you can see a cross. That marks a grave from the 1860s. Out that way, there's a man buried with his wife on his right side, but the woman he loved is buried on his left. Over that way, there's a Confederate soldier buried, a Confederate veteran, but he wasn't from the American South. Nope, he was a Scotsman. And there was no particular war in Europe at the time, and he was just, being a Scotsman, itching for a fight. And so he immigrated to the Confederate States of America and fought for the Confederacy, and when he died, he was buried in this graveyard. I'm sitting on the tombstone of Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton was a World War II veteran. I noticed his gravestone and final resting place when I visited the cemetery this past Memorial Day. And thinking of this concert, I asked Mr. Hamilton if it would be okay if I sat here at his final resting place to introduce storytellers and tell a few tales from the historic low country of South Carolina myself. He didn't say no, so here we are. Now, generally, when you get to these storytelling concerts that feature ghost stories and spook tales, the storytellers take on a very hushed tone. Why is that? Well, there's an old story from South Carolina that I think answers that question. Just anytime you talk about death, you're inviting trouble, and you have to be careful. Story has it that many years ago, there were two poor bachelors who lived down in Charleston. That's about 20 miles toward the coast from here. Two poor bachelors, they worked as stevedores on the docks. One was very strong and able. The other, sickly, puny, skinny, all the time complaining about aches and pains. And so the strong and able man often did the work for two. Every night when they would go back to their tiny little rented room and lay down on their cots, the skinny, puny, sickly man who had hardly turned his hand for a good day's work would roll and toss and complain, say that his bones hurt, his stomach ached, his head throbbed, and he would always end his lamentation by saying, "I'm just tired of living. I wish I could just up and die." Well, one night the strong man, who never got any rest by hearing his roommate complain all the time, rolled over on his cot and he said, "If you want to die, just go ahead and do it. Just call for death and tell him to come and get you right now." So the puny man called out in his sickly, weak voice, "Death, oh death, come and take me, I'm tired of living." But there he was, laying on his cot, breathing as always, wheezing in and wheezing out. "Get a good breath, man," said the strong man, "and call again." So the man drew in a deep breath as best he could, and he called out again, "Death, oh death, I'm tired of living. Come and get me now." But still the night air was very still, no stirring anywhere. And then the strong man said, "He can't hear you like that. You don't yell any louder than a busted cockroach, like this." And he jumped off his cot and he flung the door open to their little rented room and he looked out on the cobblestone street and he yelled out, "Death! Oh, death!" And all of a sudden, a gray hand clapped onto his shoulder. And he turned and said, "Who are you?" And a voice said, "I'm Death. I was sitting on a stump down at the crossroads waiting for a hail when you called." And Death took the strong man and left the poor, weak, sickly man sitting on his cot all alone. And that's why we speak about these things in hushed tones. Now, if you were to go out into the country, this is a town graveyard, a small city back in the Civil War days. But if you were to go out into the country graveyards, you'd find all kinds of talismans and interesting things laying about on top of graves. That's so that the people who are buried there will not wander. Oh yes, I've seen a woman's entire life possessions, all of her furniture, stacked onto her grave because her heirs were afraid that she might wander away if they divided up her things and took them. She'd come looking for them. And so they just stacked all of her worldly goods right on top of her grave, and all of her furniture is there rotting down into the earth to be with her remains. Oh yes, you see things like that all over in the country graveyards. Everybody has their own way of keeping away trouble. Y'all know about the hag? Oh, you should know about the hag. By day, the hag is a very respectable woman. She might be the preacher's wife. She might be a school teacher. But at night, it's a different story. At night, the hag can peel off her skin just like you peel out of an old wet raincoat, and then she's nothing but raw meat from the top of her head all the way down. And the hag is like a witch. She can ride. Oh yes, she doesn't need a broom though. No, she can float on the softest breeze. Anywhere there's a wind or a stirring of the air, the hag can ride. She can float right through an open window. She can flatten herself down and shinny under the crack of a door. And in the middle of the night, the hag will ride you. Oh yes, she will. You say, stuff and nonsense. Oh no, that is true. The hag will ride you. Have you ever been laying in bed at night and all of a sudden you have the sensation that you're falling through the air, only you really weren't going anywhere? It was like a dream. That's the hag. She's riding you. As they say in the old Gullah language, the Creole language of the slaves from slave time, as they say, she gwan dead you. She gonna suck your breath out and you gwan be dead. Now, if you ain't want the hag for dead you, there's things you can do. You can lay your shoes under the bed. Nobody really knows why, but for some reason, that will repel the hag. You can lay an open Bible by your door. When the hag passes a holy book, she is compelled to read it back to front. That'll keep her busy all night long. You can pour salt across your windowsills and across the door jamb. The hag won't cross a salt line. That'll repel the hag. If your house is near the river, you'll be okay, because the hag, she won't cross running water. If nothing else, whenever you strike a match and you blow it out, then take the burnt match stem and twist it up into your hair. If you keep some twisted match stems in your hair, that'll keep the hag away. Well, there's all kinds of things people do to keep the hag away. Some people stick a bunch of old blue bottles on tree branches and put that old bottle tree out in the front yard. That'll keep the hag away. In those country cemeteries where people pile all of a person's possessions on the grave, sometimes they surround the cemetery with a wall painted a light blue color. That's called haint blue. That'll keep the hag away. It also keeps the ghost and the haints in the graveyard where they belong. Now, if you suspect somebody of being a hag, then you sleep with a knife under your bed. And in the middle of the night, if you have that falling sensation like you're flying through the air, don't scream, don't open your mouth. She'll suck your breath out and you gonna be dead. Just reach for that knife and slash quick. And if you're lucky, you'll cut her hand off. You won't see a thing. You might hear a shriek, but she'll just be gone. But the next day when you go to church and the preacher's wife keeps her hand tucked in her shawl, and when it's time to pass the peace, she won't extend the right hand of fellowship, you'll know she's a hag. Or if you go to the schoolhouse of a Monday morning and the teacher says, I hurt my hand last night. I'm going to need a helper to write the lesson on the board. You'll know she's a hag. If you want to get rid of the hag, you've got to find where she hides her skin. When she climbs out of that old skin, she'll roll it up and tuck it underneath the door or into a hollow tree, maybe behind a tombstone. Wherever you find it hidden, unroll that old skin and fill it full of salt. And then when she comes back from riding and she climbs into her skin, she'll shrivel up like a slug and you'll be rid of the hag. You might say, I don't believe in such things. I'm not from the South Carolina Low Country. I have no need for a bottle tree in my yard or a Hank Blue wall around our community cemetery. I have no need to put my shoes under the bed. I have no need to pour salt in the door jamb or in the windowsill. Maybe you have no need and maybe you do. You see, everybody fears something. It's just that the charms that we surround ourselves with go by different names these days. Now, to ward off things that we fear, we call them things like 401k, insurance policy, hedge funds, and prenuptial agreements. But you have to agree, those are simply charms to ward off what you fear might be coming, just like the hag. Now you want to meet somebody who knows something about talismans and charms and things to keep evil away. You want to know Donna Washington. Donna Washington is a storyteller well known for spook tales and stories of the dark 30 and stories that you tell in hushed tones. The thing I like most about Donna Washington is that she's very frightening. You know why she's so frightening? She knows the truth, and she's willing to tell it like it is. Here's Donna Washington telling a story about such things as might keep away the hag.
He had always been afraid. Ever since he was very little, the world terrified him. As a little boy, his father would hunt up 4-leaf clovers for him, and he'd walk around holding them between himself and the world. As he got a little older and his fear did not ease, they had a 4-leaf clover made for him out of leather. He slept with it, he held on to it. Some people thought him simple, and they thought about the day he would become the king and they would be able to take advantage of him. But he wasn't simple. He was a very smart young man. He excelled in his studies. He was very kind to people. He was understanding. He was a good listener. But always he held that leather 4-leaf clover. Always he held it to him to ward off the darkness. And it seemed that that would be enough. But as he got older, the world intruded on his little mind, his fears, and superstitions began to play at him. He was afraid of black cats. He was afraid of ladders. The older he got, the more he learned, the more terrified he became. And soon that leather 4-leaf clover wasn't enough. He still held on to it as tight as he could, but he was frightened. And no one knew how frightened he was until his father died, and he became the king. The first thing he did was had every black cat in the kingdom boiled, because he was afraid they might cross his path. If he was up and around, no ladders could be up because he was afraid he might walk underneath one. If you broke a mirror, you would be banished for 7 years. The more he heard of things that were superstitious and terrifying to him, the more afraid he became, the more he tried to immure himself against what he feared was the darkness outside. He began to use the treasury, the kingdom's treasury, to buy bits of junk and sacred relics. You could tell him anything was lucky or safe, and he would pay anything you asked for it. Charlatans from all across the world came to the king, and he bought just bits of junk from everyone. And then that was bad enough, but the worst were the counselors who showed up wearing dark robes, mumbling under their breath, and they would tell him ridiculous, foolish nonsense, and he would listen to it, he would lap it up. Now his counselors, the ones who had been with his kingdom since his father's time, they were very worried about this. They did not know what they could do to make this young man find a way in the world. And they knew he was smart, he was capable. They just had to find some way to mend the fear in his heart. And they did not know what it was going to be. Finally, one night after the king had gone to bed, they all gathered in the top tower, set a guard there so no one would hear them. And they thought about what they could do. And they came up with an idea. We must find something and tell the king it's so lucky, so sacred, that he won't need any of this other stuff, and maybe he'll stop bleeding us dry. Well, they chatted about that. They thought that was a good idea, and they came up with the perfect thing. The next day, they went to the king. His mummers were standing, the people mumbling and making bizarre predictions and spouting out every now and again, "I see the North Star." They were standing around the throne, looking all serious and ridiculous. And the advisors came up and said, "Your Majesty, we consulted an oracle," and they gave him some faraway land. The king's eyes grew wide. "We asked this man how you might be healed of your fear." "I'm not afraid." "The king is not afraid," the magicians. And he said, No, we understand. Not your fear. Be safe from all the things in the world, darkness in the world. And the magician started mumbling, he says, "Your Majesty, please listen to us." And the king held up his hand, and all of his magicians and stargazers, they went quiet. And his advisors said, "Your Majesty, what you need is in here." And they handed him the scroll, and he opened it carefully, for the parchment was old. And it said that if the king could get someone to make him a shirt in the gray graveyard at midnight under a full moon, why, that thing would be so lucky, so blessed, he would never need anything else. And the king carefully rolled up that scroll and said, "You tell my royal tailors that every single one of them must go into the gray graveyard and make me a shirt." Well, that's not quite what they had in mind, but that was fine, except for one thing. The gray graveyard was haunted. If anyone ever tried to spend the night in there, they would be found in the morning with their hands cut off at the wrists and their feet cut off at the ankles, dead as you could imagine, with a look of absolute horror on their faces. And so when the king announced he wanted all the tailors to go and make him shirts, every tailor in the kingdom had business elsewhere. And the king was without his shirt. And he sat in the throne, worried that something was going to come get him until he got this shirt. And the advisors were beginning to think perhaps they had miscalculated. He was worse than ever. But in the kingdom, there was a woman. Her name was Caitlin. And when she was younger, she'd worked in the kingdom, in the castle, and she'd been a seamstress, and she sewed quite a fine seam. But she'd gotten older and slower, and they had to let her go with a little pension, but not much. And so she thought to herself, well, if it's a shirt he's wanting, I think I can manage that. And so she went to the king, and he said, you are not one of my royal tailors. And she said, no, but I did work in the castle, and I'm willing to make a shirt for you, but only if you give me my weight in gold and a fine house by the sea. The king said, done. Well, his advisors wanted to stop it, but they figured if she really could make the shirt, then it would be money well spent, and then they would start rebuilding the kingdom's fortunes. And so this woman, she measured the king, because she hadn't sewn anything for him since he was younger. She measured him, she went home, she cut out the silk for his shirt. Now, she didn't say she was going to cut it out in the graveyard, just sew it. And she waited. Now, part of her was thinking she didn't have to go out there at all. Who would know if she'd been in the gray graveyard? But when she went, there were 2 guards waiting outside for her to make sure she did indeed go in. So she waved, she nodded at them, and she went in. Now, the gray graveyard was abandoned, had been abandoned for a long time. The stones were askew, they were falling down, there was weeds everywhere. No one went in there, it was dangerous and scary. Well, she found a place where one of the tombstones was like a flat rectangle, sort of raised rectangle. And there was a tombstone next to it that had fallen over, and it was flat on the top. It made a great table. So she sat on the little rectangular one, and she used the big slab, and she put the pieces of the shirt there. She took her needle, her thread. She threaded her needle, and she waited. And then, boom, boom. Far away in the town, she could hear the church bells going off. She waited until the last stroke of midnight. She picked up the shirt and she began to sew. Neat, even stitches. Neat, even stitches. Neat, even stitches. Neat, even... She laughed. This is ridiculous. This place isn't haunted. Neat, even stitches. But even as she said that, and the last stroke of midnight dwindled away, as it left, it took the sounds of the crickets with it. And the night birds stopped calling. The buzzing, the clicking, all of the music of the night went still. Neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches. And then a wind began to rustle the grass in the graveyard. She looked around. Neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches. She turned it over. Neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches. The other side of the sleeves, neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches. A wind began to swirl in the graveyard. It went around each of the gravestones, and as it did, a juiceless voice began to cry out, Karen, Karen. Their voices melded and moved together, and she realized it was the voices of the dead. The voices of the dead calling out, looking for the people who had abandoned them. Neat, even stitches, 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 neat, even stitches. She sewed as fast as she could. Her stitches were small, and they were neat, but they were getting a little more desperate. Neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches. The sounds in the graveyard got louder and louder. But the last voice she heard was not a voice from the dead. And the last name she heard was her own. Caitlin. She pulled off the one side, she turned the shirt over. Neat, even stitches, neat, even stitches, neat. Caitlin! She looked up. There was a patch of weedy, muddy ground just off to the side. And as she stared at it, the ground began to shake. And out of the middle of it came a thin backbone rising up out of the ground. There was pale skin hanging off of it, translucent. You could see through it. You could see all the articulated bones. And that backbone got longer and longer and longer. And then out came a head, bone, its eyes empty, but for a small glow somewhere deep inside. Its teeth, the ones it still had, were sharp and crooked. It came further out of the ground, one of its great hands all clawed. And then it pulled itself up out of the ground. Its back feet were long and bony, with claws. Its hand long and bony. But its left hand ended in a large bone sword. Neat, even stitch, neat, even stitch, neat, even stitch. Caitlin, look at my right foot, once so fine and firm, but now skin and bone am I. All I lack is flesh. Need stitches. Caitlin, look at my right foot, once so fine and firm, but now skin and bone am I. All I lack is flesh. Just one last side. Just up the sleeve, towards the collar. Stitches. Caitlin, look at my right hand, once so fine and firm, but now skin and bone am I. All I lack is flesh. Need stitches. She was almost done. Need stitches. Oh, they weren't neat. They weren't even, but they were there. Need stitches. Caitlin, look at my left hand, once so fine and firm, but now skin and bone am I. All I lack is flesh. And he ran his fingernails over that bone sword. She finished with that shirt. She stood up very quietly, and she looked up at that thing and said, "Skin and bone, are you? Flesh is what you like. You can't have mine!" And she turned and ran. That thing stood up. It was 12 feet in height, and it said, "No, you will not take what is mine." And then it went over on all fours like a giant spider, smiling at her, and took off running. Caitlin went through the gate. She said to the guards, "There's something coming," and she took off running. The guards turned to face it. And as she ran through the night, she could hear them screaming. She felt bad about that, but she had to get that shirt to the king. She ran, and as she ran, she began to look over her shoulder, and in the pale moonlight, she could see it coming. Galloping over the ground, some horrible spider on all fours, its translucent skin swinging in the night breeze. There was a scowl on its toothy face. She got to the gates of the castle. "Let me in! And there was a voice from inside. "Who comes here?" "I come here. I'm Caitlin. You have to let me in." "The guard, we will not open the gate until morning, lady." "You have to let me in. I have the king's shirt." "What are you doing with the..." "Let me in!" And then she could almost feel it behind her. She turned around. It was coming out of the trees. It saw that she was up against a gate. "I will have what is mine." But the gate opened. Caitlin fell back into it. She heard that thing scream. She took her foot and pushed that door closed as hard as she could. She scrambled up. Block the gate! The gatekeepers were quite surprised at this hysterical woman, but they did. They slid the bolt. Bang! Something hit the outside of the gate, and there was more screaming. They just backed up. Caitlin fainted right there. Well, the next morning, she went to see the king with his shirt. Well, she had run through some pretty rough terrain. The brambles had caught the thing and torn it. It was filthy. She tried to wash it, and it was stained. It was hopeless, but it was the best she could. And she came shamefacedly and presented the slightly destroyed, stained shirt. And the king loved it. Oh, he actually stood up and made them disrobe him right there and put on the shirt. Now, she was a good seamstress. It fit like a glove. And then he put all of his old clothes on, his clothes on over it. And he could feel the power and magic of that shirt healing his heart. "I want to see my people," he announced. "I want to go outside." The magicians who had been, working on keeping him frightened were quite surprised by the change in him. They looked at each other and realized it wasn't going to take long before he realized that they had been trying to cheat him, and they all began to filter out of the throne room. As for the king himself, his counselors, and Caitlin, they led him to the doors. They unbarred the doors, and when they opened them, something was swinging over the king's head. And when he looked up, he discovered that buried deep into the wood was a bone sword. And at the very end of it, a broken off bone joint, as if whatever had put it in there had wounded, maimed its own self to get free of the door. Well, it may be that that shirt really was lucky. It was certainly lucky for Caitlin. She got her house by the sea and her weight in gold. And it was lucky for the king, for with his shirt, he became a truly, truly good leader. And he was sorry about all the money he'd wasted early in his time as king, and he worked hard to build up his kingdom and care for his people. As for the graveyard, perhaps it was the luckiest thing of all for that place, because once the king had his new shirt, the creature who'd haunted its environs was never seen again. And the people from the town came and cut the grass and put the gravestones to right and honored their ancestors. And that is the story of the Bookin in the Grey Graveyard.
You've got to come visit Summerville. You've seen the graveyard at night, but you need to come in person and visit the church during the day. It's a lovely old 19th century chapel with a beautiful stained glass window over the altar. Come on a Sunday morning when we're having a sung service, which means there are extra hymns and choir numbers. Maybe if you're here at the right time of year, you might hear us singing the Old Navy hymn. Every once in a while here at St. Paul's we sing that song. Hear us as we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea. Whenever we sing that hymn, I always think of a tombstone that's just behind the church. It's for a young girl named Elvira. Her story is written on the tombstone itself. She died just off of the beach on Sullivan's Island. She threw herself into the water to save a 5-year-old child who was drowning. She managed to save the boy and then drown herself before she could get back to shore. And her remains are interred just behind the church here at St. Paul's. The people of the low country of South Carolina have long had a relationship with the sea. We know of many perils in the sea. As I speak to you now, there are 5 active storms in the Atlantic Ocean. We know a thing or two about perils of the sea, but not all the perils are of natural causes. Sometimes they're very unnatural. I don't know if you can hear it. You hear that train whistle? That means the spirits are with us. If you're a Jonesboro regular to the National Storytelling Festival, you know that the ghost concert is often interrupted by a train. This is a very, very good omen. Now, where was I? Oh, yes, perils of the sea. Not all the perils of the sea are of natural causes. In fact, some of them are quite unnatural, like the pirate Blackbeard. He was a most unnatural man. In 1718, Blackbeard the pirate came to the Charlestown harbor with a small flotilla of ships. He was a menacing character to look at, was Blackbeard, a huge hulk of a man. He stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, very thick round the middle, muscular arms. He wore long, coarse black hair that trailed nearly to his waist. He had a beard that matched, trailing down his front almost to his stomach. He would often braid that beard into 13 braids, just for the superstition of the thing. When he got into a battle, he would stick little bits of rope that he had soaked in lime oil beneath his hat, and he would set them ablaze and they would smolder. Smoke would appear to be coming out of his ears as he charged into battle with a brace of pistols round his middle and a cutlass in his hand. Many a person threw their arms up in surrender just to see him approach. He didn't even have to use the weapons that he brandished. Blackbeard gave piracy, he single-handedly gave piracy the reputation that it enjoys in the movies today. Blackbeard was ruthless. And when he came to the Charlestown harbor, I'm just going to wait for that train to pass. All right, I think he's had his say. When Blackbeard came to the Charlestown harbor, he would not let any ship pass into the harbor or pass out unless they would pay a high ransom. When a passenger ship bound for England headed out of the mouth of the harbor, Blackbeard lashed alongside and took about 40 people prisoner. One of the prisoners was a Mr. Samuel Wragg and his 4-year-old son. Blackbeard knew, Samuel Wragg being a leader of the colony of South Carolina, he knew that he had a very good bargaining chip in Samuel Wragg. And he sent word by a messenger in a small boat into the city of Charlestown that he demanded a chest of silver and a chest of medicine. He even noted that he needed the medicine because some of his crew were suffering from the French disease. If he did not get his demands within 48 hours, he would start killing passengers one by one, and he would start with Samuel Wragg, one of the city father's 4-year-old son. Well, when the governor of South Carolina received this message, he was worried. The colony of South Carolina had a strict policy that they would not negotiate with pirates, but there was a 4-year-old child's life at stake, and so they gave in to Blackbeard's demands, and they sent back by the messenger a chest of silver and a chest of medicines, and then Blackbeard let all the prisoners go. He did not murder a single person, and he let it slip that he was headed south for his escape. And of course, he went immediately north. Well, we sent out a crew to try and capture him, but when we went south, we missed him. And a crew, sometime later from Virginia, found him north of the South Carolina colony. He was in Ocracoke Inlet in North Carolina. He had pulled his ship up into a river, and they had him trapped. The ships lashed alongside, and a great battle ensued. Blackbeard was sliding across the deck of his own ship, slipping in his victim's blood. He reached for a gun at his waist, and when he pulled out the blunderbuss, a man from behind chopped Blackbeard right in the base of the neck with his sword and cut a major artery, and Blackbeard bled out very quickly. The ship's surgeon conducted a quick autopsy on deck the ship. They found that his body was riddled with bullet holes and slashed with cutlass marks, and somehow he had managed to fight for well over an hour before he finally fell. It was that last chop right to the base of the neck that had done him in. The governor of Virginia was paying a large sum of money for Blackbeard's head. Since he had a price on his head, that's the only part of him they bothered to take back to Virginia. They chopped his head off, threw the rest of him overboard. Legend has it that he was so mean, he swam around the ship 3 times before he sank out of sight. They hung the head on the bowsprit of the boat and took it back to Virginia, and they say that the governor of Virginia stuck it up on a pike, and people came from all around the colony to see the famous criminal's visage until all the flesh and hair had rotted away and there was nothing left but a skull. And then the governor had the top of the skull sawn off and had the whole thing silver plated so that he could stick his fingers in the eye sockets of Blackbeard's skull, fill it full of ale, and swill out of his enemy's head whenever he felt like remembering his revenge on Blackbeard the pirate. I know a storyteller who knows a thing or two about perils of the sea. Her name is Megan Wells. Now, I say that Donna Washington is scary because she knows the truth and she's not afraid to tell it. I'll tell you, Megan Wells is scary because when she finds a good spook tale or a story that lends itself to horror, she doesn't run away from it. Oh no, she runs straight toward it. Listen to this story about perils of the sea from Megan Wells.
I think it's a full moon. We're out in my backyard. I wanted to be out here so we could hear the cicadas singing the songs of summer for ghost stories. This one from 1912 by William Hope Hodgson is called The Derelict, and I've adapted it for storytelling. Here we go. A ship. No, not a steamship. A sailing clipper with 3 tall masts of 42 white sails, slender and swift. She'd shipped out of London through the English Channel, turned south along the tea routes to China, 65 days of fair and beautiful winds, until they came to the south tip of Africa, were just ready to turn the bend toward the Cape when a white swelter rushed out of the west, lightning and foam, a dreadful storm. She took it very hard. She took in water into her seams. Her mainsail was sprung, rope was flying everywhere, several hundred miles off course, and the 2 rescue boats over the sides. But in the morning, the storm was over, and a brilliant sun showed a calm sea, so the navigator, Selvern, the second mate, was standing starboard at the railing with his scoping glass and saw to the west another vessel. Some strange vessel had just appeared out of the storm. Now, standing next to him was a young man, fresh from medical school. He had secured his first post as a doctor on a sailing ship. He stood with his hands, both hands, gripping the railing as if he was afraid that the storm might start up again on the instant. He was wan. He looked out of place next to the tanned and seaworthy Selvern. Selvern might have laughed at the young doctor's nerves, but that the rest of the crew had already been laughing most of the journey, so he had taken the young doctor under his wing for a protection. Here, doctor, take a look in the glass. It's a rum-looking packet. The doctor put the glass to his eye and looked out. It has an old-fashioned look about it. There's a dozen rum things wrong with her. That's a derelict. Yeah, she's all rotted away. There's not a yard left aloft. Wonder if standing rigging hasn't gone down too. Look at her bow. She ought to have gone down to Davy Jones long time ago. Captain, let's have a look at her. I dare say she'd be worth it. Captain Gannington was standing mid-deck with his crew, rolling arm up around their burly arms, rolling that rope around those burly arms. When the work is over, Mr. Selvern, I can't spare the men right now. We have to get ship shape. Curiosity still drew him to the rail. He borrowed Selvern's glass and he looked out at that vessel derelict. We'll go out in my gig after the second dog watch. If the glass remains steady. Well, at that, the captain turned all the men to it, even the doctor, kept them hard at it until after sunset, second dog watch, he manned the captain's gig with 6 crew at the oars, his second mate, Mr. Selvern, and at Mr. Selvern's urging, the young doctor. Well, Tom Harrison, tall and strong, was at the stroke oar pulling, and so they quickly shortened that distance between the two vessels. The sunset disappeared behind the derelict, which made a flare of red light, blurring the ship from view. Keep pulling, lads. We've got to get closer to get a good look at her. Captain, yes, Tom. There's something in the water pulling back on the oars. Nonsense. Captain looked over into the water. Selvern. Second mate Selvern looked over into the water. Doctor looked over into the water. It was a brown scum, glowing red from the setting light. And that brown scum was coming up alongside both sides of the captain's gig. Queer stuff, said the captain. What do you make of it, Selvern? Oh, there's something rotted in the derelict's cargo. It's working its way out through her seams. Can't be old tea, can it? Pull, lads! There was no talk after that. Pulling was so hard. And there was, in fact, a faint as if the oars were being sucked by that brown scum. Well, the sun disappeared into the horizon, resolving that red flare, revealing that derelict looming in front of them, as if she'd snuck up on them. Oh, she's old, Captain. That's an old schooner. The ship was old. There was clumpings of sea fungi all along its sides. And the figurehead had a beard of rime and marine growths hanging all the way down into the scum that evidently held her in and now held the captain's gig. Out of duty, the captain called up, "Ahoy there! Aboard! Ahoy!" There was silence. "Harrison, get the boat hook. Secure us and bring me your oar." Tom Harrison got the boat hook, secured it to the side, brought his oar, 14-foot ash oar. The captain laid it up against the side of that derelict. "All right, Harrison, up you go, and I'll hand you the lanterns." Harrison scrambled up. "The sides are soft, Captain." "Don't be daft. Look sharp." Handed the lanterns. "Selvern, you coming?" Captain went up. Selvern went to the oar, stopped, turned around and looked at the doctor. "You coming or no?" The doctor took a breath, went to the oar, climbed up the oar. Selvern at the last, the 4 men aboard the derelict. The smell. Tom Harrison was trying not to gag. "What is it, Captain? Is it some kind of mold?" "No. Rats," said Selvern. "Must be lots of rats." "No," said the doctor, "it's not either. It's..." He shook his head as if he was having an inner argument. It's like..." Captain spun round. "Like what?" "No, can't say. Can't say until I'm sure. Give me a lantern." "Captain, took a lantern, handed the other to Selvern, and those two old salts lifted up the slides on the sides of those lanterns. So then, holding them high, those wide beams of light touched the whole of the ship, which was gray. Grayish green, like a skin covering all of it, disguising everything. "Sure," said the captain, "it's mold." And then, peering about, his eyes caught two mounds at either side of the boat. Guns. I thought as much, Selvern. It was a privateer. That'll explain the cargo. That'll explain the scum. We've got to get below. And so they set off to try to find the companionway. Well, the doctor stood motionless. Tom Harrison, motionless too. "Are you coming or no? Make up your mind, Doctor." "Tom." "Aye, Captain." Doctor snapped to, ran to catch up. The two ran together, and it seemed as if Tom must be stepping on the back of his boots, but it wasn't Tom at all. It was the deck. It seemed as if the deck was pulling or gripping at the bottom of his boots. Tom Harrison noticed it too. "Did you see that, Doctor? It's like the scum pulling on the oars." Well, they arrived to the doctor and the second mate, who were looking up at the main pole, covered in salt encrustations from top to bottom. Selvern went round to do some more investigating. "Captain, aye, sea lice." "What? Sea lice? Hundreds of them. Come and look." There were hundreds of sea lice on the deck, but not black, no, clear, and some of them huge. They looked like they were filled with water, but in it you could see the bits of the gray mold that they were eating. "I've never seen the like of it except on a living cod," said Selvern. "What are they doing here?" "Oh, pay them no mind. They won't bring us any harm. We've got little time, and we've got to get to the hold. Come now." Captain set off again. The rest of the men followed, and there, toward the stern of the boat, there what must have been the companionway, now completely disguised, of course, by that gray-green mold. The captain gave it a good kick, and the whole thing wobbled sloppily. There's no woodwork. It's all gone soft. "Doctor, take my lantern." The captain hauled back to give it a heavier kick, but Selvern stopped him. "Don't." "What?" "Listen. I don't hear anything. Listen. Don't be fancying things, Mr. Selvern. I've got to shift this muck if we're going to get below." But then they heard it. It was a rhythmic beating from down below, from somewhere down below the derelict. Beating like a heartbeat. And then they saw the companionway was attuned to that beating, was quivering with the beating. And now that quivering was slowly descending and becoming ripples, and the ripples were still descending all the way to the bottom of the companionway and then rolled out onto the deck, rolling and rippling until it shuddered right underneath Tom Harrison's boots. Well, Tom Harrison had it. Yelled, grabbed the lantern from the doctor, turned and ran it back over the deck, back toward the boat, back toward the captain's gig. Well, the captain hollered at him, of course, "Bring me back that lantern!" But Tom couldn't hear because he was now stuck in the deck. He was pulling up his feet one at a time, pulling up his feet up out of the deck. The lantern now was swinging wildly from side to side as he now tried to pull up his left leg, and then losing his balance, pulled again on the right leg. The mold had gone all the way up to his knee. When he pulled it out, it was gone bloody. He dropped that lantern. He fell face first onto the deck. The mold came onto him, over him, covered him completely. Where Tom had been standing, there was now nothing but an elongated cocoon of wriggling mold. And then there was a shudder underneath Selvern's boots. He tried to shift his legs. He could not shift his legs, lost his balance, flung out his arm, grabbed onto the captain. "It's got hold of my feet. It's got a hold of my feet. Doctor." Doctor swung into action. He put his arms underneath Selvern's arm, grabbed tightly around his chest. The captain lurched, got his arms around Selvern's waist. "Now pull." They pulled. They pulled. They heaved mightily to rip Selvern out from that clinging muck. Selvern's scream was of agonizing pain. He lost consciousness, fell up against the captain. "Run, doctor, run. Go stern, go toward the railing. Lads, bring the boat aft. Bring the boat aft." Well, the oarsmen, when they heard Tom Harrison scream, they had already unsecured the boat hook, and they were already pulling. And when they heard Selvern scream, they knew which direction. They were pulling and pulling through that resisting scum. "We're coming, Captain," they called from the dark. Well, the doctor was already running, but he had no lantern. He was simply running in that dark, for a cloud had come and covered the moon. He reached for his matches, lit a match, saw the railing, threw the match over the railing. "Boat ahoy!" Match fell slowly down. It was dark again. He made his way toward that railing, lit another match to see, and there, at the back of the boat, at the stern of the boat, by the light of that match, piles of bones, white, clean, dry bones. Tom Harrison was not the first. The match went out. Captain made it alongside. Doctor shook Selvern. Selvern came to, enough to realize the danger. They helped Selvern climb up to the railing. "Boys, He jumped down, landed into the boat. There was the sound of a splintering oar. Doctor went next. Captain came last. "Pull, boys," said the captain. He clambered to the front of the boat, took up Tom Harrison's oar. Tom Harrison's partner asked, "Where's Tom?" "Dead. Pull. Don't talk, or we'll all be dead." They pulled, and the doctor, well, he was ripping his shirt so that he might wrap up Selvern's wounds. The boots were gone, the trousers were gone. It was bloody, and the feet. He wrapped it to stop the flow of blood. And then the clouds came away from the moon, and by that moonlight, the doctor could see coming from that monster ship tentacles, gray, green lippets of mold reaching out for those 7 warm men. She's alive. What he'd been afraid to say was now inarguable. The ship's alive, Captain. Get to the bow of the boat, Doctor. Use the boat hook to try to cut away the scum. Doctor did so, got the boat hook, started cutting. Selvern shifted his weight until he was at the stern of the boat, grabbed up that splintered oar and began to swing wildly in the dark. They cut and they pulled and swung and pulled and cut and pulled and cut and pulled and cut, until at last they emerged out of it into the clear, clean, open sea. Thank God. And then there was a whining, a low whining. Captain, asked the doctor, so new to the sea. What's that? Storm's coming. Aye, said Selvern. Wind. The clouds had gathered tremendously dark. There was now no moon. Pull, lads, put your back into it, or we'll never put our teeth through good bread again. They pulled, they flew through that water. They were aboard that ship before that storm came, a furious smother out from the west, with a whining and a piping like a steam whistle racing across the sea. Below deck, the doctor examined Mr. Selvern. His vitals were strong. He'd pull through, but his feet... Privately in his notes, the doctor wrote, the second mate's feet had the appearance of being partially digested. I know no other words that so exactly describes their condition. Morning brought a brilliant sun, and Selvern handed his scoping glass to the doctor. Go topside, make a report. The doctor went topside, went to that starboard railing, looked through that glass, and if any cruiseman made any remark, it was praise. There would be no more laughing. Through the glass, the doctor saw nothing. The derelict was gone. She'd been brought by a storm and was taken by a storm. Lost now. Lost as utterly as any heart could wish. The Derelict by William Hope Hodgson.
Be careful if you go looking for ghosts, because you just might find them. Don't look. If you're laying in your bed at night and you hear the rumble of wagon wheels and the clatter of horses' hooves, the tramp, tramp, tramp of boots in the street, don't get up to see who moves. Don't look. You hear a voice yelling, "Step up there, get in line." You hear horses clip-clopping on the cobblestones and straining against the leather harness that pulls the heavy wagons and the big cannons. You lay still in your bed. Don't look. Don't peek through the curtains. Don't crack open a shutter. And for heaven's sake, don't stand in the doorway gawking like you're looking at P.T. Barnum's freak show. Don't look. Everybody knows that sound. That is the sound of the marching dead. Many of them are buried here in this graveyard. Soldiers who fell during the war. Most of them were not so fortunate to have a marked grave like you would find here. They were buried in the fields and the forests wherever they fell. And the last thing they heard was that General Lee needed reinforcements in Virginia. So on any given night, you never can tell when, sometimes at the dark of the moon, sometimes at the bright full moon, they rise up and they muster a ghostly army and they go marching northward toward Virginia, and you may hear them passing by your door, but don't look. And then there are the singing dead. Particularly in the fall of the year, men go hunting deer on horseback out on the old plantation properties not far from this historic place. And sometimes their horse steps down, trods down with its hoof on the final resting place of a soldier who died years ago, laying beneath the moss and ferns. Since there's no tombstone marking his final resting place, he sings out. Now, the song is very strange. It's not in a major key. And it's not quite minor. It's much more macabre than that. It's best if you just step aside. Don't sing. Just listen. Be respectful. And then there are the thirsting dead. They reach out to touch you. Many of those old plantation houses were abandoned after the war, and squatters moved in. Not long after the war, there was a woman who lived in one of those houses, didn't own the place. She was just residing there. She sent her young daughter down to the well just at evening to fetch back a pitcher of water. The girl took the water jug and went down to the well and drew up a bucket of water and poured the water over into the jug. And then she lifted the jug up onto her shoulder and she started back toward the house. And just as her slippered foot fell on the front porch steps, that jug was lifted off her shoulder, and it passed through the air, held up by some unseen force. After it had traveled through the air about 4 or 5 feet away, it tilted, and a silver stream of water glistening in the moonlight trickled out and fell toward the floor and disappeared from sight. This action was followed by a long, satisfied sigh as if a thirsty man had been given a cool drink of water. Then the jug righted itself, it floated through midair a little further, it tilted again, another silver stream trickled out. This action was repeated over and over again until the jug floated back to the girl's hands, completely empty, bone dry. Scared out of her wits, the girl dropped the jug and it shattered on the floor of the front porch. She ran inside and told her mother what had happened, and her mother said, "Oh, that's just the thirsty dead." This house was used as a field hospital during the war. Men were laid out on that long front porch piazza waiting to see the doctor, and many of them died from exposure, died before they could see the surgeon, died from lack of something as simple as a cool drink of water. They take in death what they did not receive in life. You'll just have to go back and fill the pitcher again. But the girl explained that she couldn't. She had dropped the pitcher and broke it into 100 pieces. But when her mother pushed her back out onto the front porch, there was that pitcher sitting upright in the middle of the floor, completely mended. Added to it was a silver rim all around the top. You couldn't see a crack, as if it were never broken. The thirsting dead. They have their own way of saying thank you for a cool drink of water. Now the marching dead and the singing dead and the thirsting dead, they won't hurt you. They won't molest you. They don't mean you any harm. They just want you to know they are there. And as long as you tell the old stories and sing the old songs, especially if you do that within their hearing. And that is why we sit in the middle of this graveyard. They can rest easy. But if you forget the old songs and you stop telling the old tales and they feel that they are forgotten, do not be surprised if they rise up from their graves and you hear them marching past your door. And if you hear them marching past your door, don't look. Unless you're Simon Brooks. Now, Simon Brooks always looks. He looks for stories like a grave robber digging up a dead man's bones. Here I sit in a churchyard. Storyteller Simon Brooks is not unlike the old prophet Ezekiel. When he finds dry bones, given the poetic retelling of the old story that he's dug up, he makes those bones march and sing and dance. Here's a story about dug up bones from Simon Brooks.
In the 1700s, the early 1700s, you could get hung for just about anything. From stealing a sheep to stealing a handkerchief. You could be hung for stealing a handkerchief. You could be hung for very, very little. And then the rules changed. They decided that with reform, that maybe people shouldn't be hung for stealing handkerchiefs. Maybe they should go to prison or into a workhouse or something like that. Now, this created a problem, you see, for the medical establishment at the time, in its infancy. You see, there are a lot of doctors who were experimenting on cadavers. They were cutting up bodies to see how they worked. If they could find out how they worked, then they could, well, know how to fix them, I suppose. There were two students. One was called Fetz. He was just a regular young man, not too wealthy, what you might call middle class. Worked his way into school. Was able to pay his way through school, barely. He had a small room at the hospital. And this was where the bodies were delivered. And Fetz would have to sign for them and pay these people that brought bodies. You see, doctors, they needed bodies to experiment on and to teach other students who wanted to be doctors, like Fetz and McFarlane. Now, when they changed the rules and not so many people were hung, you see, when people were hung, they would send people to pretend to be related to that man who was hung or that woman who was hung. And they would pay the hangman to bring the body back for the doctors to experiment on. But when the laws changed and it was harder to be hung, there weren't so many bodies to be claimed. And so when people were buried, sometimes they were dug up and then sold, or worse. McFarlane, he came from a much wealthier family than Fetz. He had his own apartments across the road from the hospital, had his own small carriage, his small gig, if you will, had all the things that he wanted to. He did not have a good temper. He did not have a good way about him, but he was very intelligent, and he was Dr. Knox's favourite student. Fetz and McFarlane, they would set up Dr. Knox's equipment when he was teaching. They would make sure his papers were in order before he taught. They would assist on some of the experiments. Well, one day, Fetz decided he had enough change left at the end of the week that he could go and buy himself a beer across at the tavern, get himself some lunch. And so he walked into the public house. It was packed. It was very, very busy. Everybody sitting, moving around, beers being brought here, there and everywhere, people eating. And he saw McFarlane on the other side of the room, across the crowd, and he was talking to this young lady. It was a young lady that Fetz had seen before, Miss Jane, he believed her name was. Well, he started to make his way towards Macfarlane and Miss Jane, and he saw that they were actually arguing, and so he decided to stop. He didn't want to get involved. But Macfarlane was getting angrier and angrier, and Fett's worried about this. What would happen to the young lady? It seemed whatever the young lady was telling him, well, he wasn't happy about it. In the end, she stormed off out through the back door. Macfarlane followed her, anger written all over his face. Well, Fett's pushed his way through the crowd, moving people aside. He didn't want any harm to come to this young girl. But when he stepped outside, they were both gone. Maybe they'd made up and got a carriage and gone somewhere else, countryside or something. He didn't know. A couple of days later, close to 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock at Fett's door. It wasn't unusual that people would show up at 2 o'clock in the morning, especially if they were the grave robbers. So Fett got up, put a gown on, lit a lamp and made his way to the door and opened it. There were 2 burly men there, and between them was a sack. In the sack was a body. Fett pointed to the bench upon which they were to throw the body, and he set the lantern down. He then opened up the top and pulled the material down so he could see the face. There's only so much you can do with a very badly decomposed body, so they had to make sure that these bodies were as fresh as possible. When he looked at the face, my God, what have you done? What do you mean, sir? This woman. I saw her 2 days ago. I spoke to her a week ago. She was in perfect health. I don't know what you're talking about, sir. These 2 men, they got closer to Fett's. And they kind of powered themselves up. Fett's was worried. He didn't want to end up on the slab next to that young woman. So with his hands shaking, he made out the receipt and tore the piece of paper and gave it to them, made a note in the notebook and then paid the men, who left abruptly. Fett's tried to go back to sleep, but he couldn't. He paced backwards and forwards. The bruises, the scratches. He washed and got dressed. He couldn't do anything other than pace that small room. And then he heard footsteps above. He was hoping that it was Macfarlane. He ran down the corridor and up the steps to the upper floor, and sure enough it was. Macfarlane, you have to see what's going on. You have to see what's going on. Come downstairs, come downstairs. What are you talking about, Fett? What are you talking about? You have to see this, you have to see. Come on down. This is terrible. What are you talking about? Fett led Macfarlane down to that slab. Macfarlane just looked at the face that was there. And so? But you know her, do I? Yes, I saw you at the pub 2 days ago, and you and her, you were talking, you were discussing something. I didn't want to intrude. But here she is. She is dead. Look at the marks upon her throat and on her shoulders. She has been murdered. You know her. I don't know her. And I suggest that you don't know her either. What are you talking about, Macfarlane? You know very well what I'm talking about. If you know your own good, you do not know this girl, and neither do I. Fett didn't know what to do. So he decided to not know Miss Jane. When the body was used the next day for dissection, nobody else seemed to know Miss Jane either, as they worked silently upon her body. Fetz found it hard to sleep at night after that. Then a week later, McFarlane came down and said that they had a job to do. What do you mean we have a job to do? Dr. Knox has told us that there is, you will meet me tonight at 11 o'clock. I'll meet you out front. Wear dark clothes. Fetz didn't like the sound of this, but he was in no position, he thought, to argue. So that night at 11 o'clock, in his darkest clothes, he met McFarlane out front in his gig. They climbed into the gig, and he noticed in the back there was a shovel. It was starting to get dark already. There were 2 lanterns on the front of the gig, and McFarlane handed him some matches so that Fetz could light them. And McFarlane told him there has been a burial, an old man who's died, and we are to get his body. It's at such and such a village. But we're not heading in the right direction. Well, of course we're not heading in the right direction. We don't want to be seen heading out in that direction. We want to be seen heading in a different direction. But we shall cut around later as it gets darker. And off they rode. And when darkness came, McFarlane halted the gig, took some cloth out of the back and muffled the horse's hooves with this rag. And then they extinguished the lanterns and rode in the darkness. It was not a bright night. There was very little moon and very few stars, it seemed. Overcast, grey. It started to rain a little. Just light rain. It would come and it would go. Mist grew in the darkness. They had to stop a couple of times and check to see where they were to make sure that they were still on the road, let alone going in the right direction. But they eventually found their way to the graveyard. They climbed out of the gig and they took the shovel and the bag that was beneath it and took the 2 lanterns, relit them, and made their way between the stones. It was easy to find the freshly turned earth. And the two men started to dig. Down and down they dug until they hit the coffin lid. McFarlane dug harder and harder, and Fetz helped him. There was not room for both of them, so McFarlane climbed out of the grave. He knocked one of the lamps over and it broke and shattered. The other lamp, Fetz handed up to McFarlane, who held it as he started to pry the nails out, the lid of the coffin up. There indeed in the coffin was an old man. Large, across, short in stature. They pulled him out of the grave and Fetz pushed the body up to McFarlane, and McFarlane reached down and pulled the body out. And then in the light of the one lantern, they pulled the bag up and tied it over his head. And then they made their way back to the gig, struggling with the bag, throwing the body into the bag. And then they went back to get the lantern and the shovel, not even bothering to refill the grave. The lamp was extinguished, and in the darkness they left. The horse's hooves were still muffled, but in the distance the wind blew, and the wind carried the sound of dogs barking. The mist grew thicker and thicker. "We should light the lantern so we can see our way." "Not yet, not yet," said McFarlane. The body was between them on the gig, not in the back. Rain started to pour. "We should light the lantern now. The mist is hard to see through. We might get lost on our way." The sound of dogs got closer and closer. On and on they trotted. The body would fall upon McFarlane and then would fall upon Fetz. It would be that shouldering of each other. They would push it until it would settle in the middle. But Fetz noticed something. The body seemed to be getting lighter, and not as heavy when it bumped against him. In the darkness, he could see very little. But he could hear the dogs. They were now around, growling, sniffing, barking, yelping around the carriage. We should really light the lantern now. I am sure we are far enough away. I suppose so. McFarlane handed Fetz the box of matches, and he lit the lantern, closed it down, and set it on the hook on the front of the gig. They could see the shadows of dogs in the mist. But they both knew that this body was not the same body anymore, it seemed. They looked at each other and then at the sack. The rain had made it soaking wet, as they were. And the cloth clung to the figure of the body that was there. This was not the body of a large, rotund old man. The body that was sat beside them now was a woman. McFarlane told Fetz to open the bag and look. Very slowly, Fetz untied the string, opened up the sack, and pulled it down. And there was the face, the shoulders with the bruises and cuts of Miss Jane. The two men screamed and leapt out of the gig on either side, and the sound of dogs tearing, pulling apart these two young men. The horse, frightened by their cries, thundered off into the night. Word got back to the hospital. Word got back to a lot of people. And an investigation began. And that's why I'm here in this court, waiting to see the trial of Dr. Knox. The Resurrection Man. Written by Robert Louis Stevenson, retold by Simon Brooks.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening in the St. Paul's Graveyard in Summerville, South Carolina. Thank you to Donna Washington. Thank you to Megan Wells. Thank you to Simon Brooks. And a special thank you to Mr. Hughes. Mr. Hughes, it's been my great pleasure to visit with you, and I'll see you again come Memorial Day. Good night.